Welcome, folks, for this seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome Finnur Dellsén, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Iceland. Finnur is working mainly in the field of philosophy of science and epistemology, in the interplay of the two fields, in a way, working especially on explanation, understanding, abductive reasoning, those kind of notions. He has published a lot of papers in leading journals like News, Journal of Philosophy, Analysis, JPS, Philosophy of Science, and it's a very long list. And he also has a book forthcoming with Cambridge University Press on abductive reasoning, right? And he has many distinctions, but I want to mention one. He was elected reviewer of the year 2020 by BJPS. I think it's very impressive. But he has also many other distinctions, but I won't embarrass you listing all of that. Please take it away.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, and then thank you for the invitation. I've already learned a lot, and it's really been a lot of fun, and I look forward to your questions. I think I was sort of asked to maybe give a talk on scientific progress if I had anything to say on it, and initially I just didn't have anything at the moment that I wanted to talk about, and so then I ended up thinking actually I can sort of give this sort of a little bit of an overview of some of the things that I've argued for regarding scientific progress and combine that with some work in progress. And the way to do that is to talk about sort of scientific progress, but in particular how to promote it. So that's what I'm going to try to do in this talk. So I'll talk first a bit about the nature, according to me, of scientific progress, and sort of set up a little bit of the debate. For those of you who aren't super involved in it, and I think that would be most of you. And then I'll sort of try to break some new ground by talking about the promotion of scientific progress. So the main thesis, I like to kind of tell everyone where I'm going to go with things. The main thesis for which I'll be arguing, and then I'll be sort of applying this in the sort of work in progress part of the talk, is that some event or episode, I'm talking this in terms of episodes a lot, so the episode just like an extended period of time. It promotes scientific progress to the extent that it increases expected future progress. That is to say, to the extent that it increases the probability weighted sum of the amount of progress in each possible development resulting from this event. That's going to be the sort of the most positive part of the talk, is arguing for that. I'm sort of worrying, do you think I'm in picture now? Should I be standing? Is this okay?
Yeah, I think it's...
Is that right? Okay. Okay, and so that's going to be sort of the main kind of proposal in the talk. But I'm going to argue that this has three distinct, or three, I guess, related but distinct upshots. The first being that there are kind of various arguments or suggestions that we should be pluralists about progress in a certain sense. And I'll argue that those can be sort of accommodated by accounts that aren't pluralist, that are monistic in that sense. So contrary to what you might have thought, and that includes the account of scientific progress that I favor myself, which I call the noetic account. Oops, that's not good. Okay. And second upshot is kind of a similar thing, namely that there are these arguments for making justification, evidence, and various sorts of epistemic features of that kind. There are arguments for saying that those constitute progress, and those can also be accommodated by accounts like my own account, and more generally by so-called factivist accounts. I'll explain what I mean by that. And finally, again, in a similar vein, I'll argue that arguments for requiring scientific progress to be epistemically accessible, in a certain sense, to be transparent to the scientists themselves, those can also be accommodated by accounts that it supposedly is, or this requirement is supposedly problematic for, namely, again, kind of factivist accounts of progress, and that also includes the noetic account. So I mean, the idea is going to be the noetic account has these various challenges, which are also challenges for some other accounts, but if we go along with this main thesis, then those challenges can be sort of dissolved in a way. So that's just kind of an overview of where we're going. So now I'm going to try to provide a little bit of an overview of the debate, the scientific progress debate, before talking about my own views on the issue. So first point to make is sort of, if you want to have a sort of constructive discussion about scientific progress, is that it's, at least in the sense that it's being used in the literature, it's a sort of a normative concept. So it's not just the concept of a change from A to B, but the concept of a change from A to B that is such that the B is an improvement over A. So it's this kind of elementary point just about the concept of progress, quite generally. And so, I mean, kind of obvious implication of this is that when you're saying that something is scientific progress versus no scientific progress, for example, you're making a value judgment about the later state being sort of scientifically better in some sense that is yet to be specified. Another point is that in the debate about scientific progress, we have sort of restricted ourselves to the type of scientific progress that is in some sense cognitive, or you might say epistemic in a broad sense of epistemic. Because, I mean, as many people have pointed out, there are sort of many respects in which there are many respects in which science can sort of improve that don't have to do with the sorts of things that are being debated in this literature. So, for example, you could have situations in which you sort of increase the funding for science, or you increase maybe the gender equality among scientists, or you somehow let's see, what other examples can I use? You improve the organization of science in some ways, or fairness within it, or some stuff like that. So those are all kind of, in a way, improvements of science, or ways in which science would become better in some sense of the term, but they're not sort of what the scientific progress debate, as it's sort of, at least not in the way that it's been conducted, is supposed to be about. There's some sort of narrower sense of progress that is in some sense cognitive or epistemic, and then of course it's a little bit up to debate exactly how to understand this notion of a cognitive kind of progress, but that's at least the intention, to capture this kind of scientific progress rather than some other. So with that sort of in mind, there's been this sort of prominent debate between four kinds of accounts of scientific progress. The first is, in some ways, it's maybe a very influential view for a very long time in the 20th century, according to which you make scientific progress when you get closer to the truth. That is to say, you increase what's called, slightly technical term, what's called verisimilitude, or the truth likeness of our theories. And then part of the research program that this kind of view engendered is about defining in a sufficiently precise way, and without avoiding certain problems with it, this notion of verisimilitude or truth likeness. So that's kind of, in other words, closeness to truth. Something that isn't quite true necessarily, but still close to being true. So that's kind of what the truth likeness account has to do in order to be spelled out in any sufficient detail. There's a lot of work on that, including by Niiinluoto and also by Graham Audi, among others. Another kind of account is sort of, in a way, diametrically opposed to the truth likeness account. It's sort of often sort of posed as a very different kind of account, which is sometimes called usually called the problem-solving account, which is something that's suggested by Kuhn in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but is then developed by Larry Lawden, who argued that you make progress when you solve, or alternatively eliminate, or sort of do away with problems that seem to be, at least from the point of view of a research tradition or a paradigm, to be significant or important. And solving or eliminating those problems is what counts as progress. Okay. I'll just go ahead. No worries. Yeah. Then there's much more recently. There's Alexander Bird proposed or kind of revived, I suppose, in a way, a view according to which scientific progress just consists in the accumulation of propositional knowledge. So you just know more things than before. In that case, you just make progress. It's kind of a simple view, and he kind of defended it in a new kind of way and argued against both of these alternative views in this 2007 paper in particular, and then in some more recent publications as well, including a recent book that I'm not citing here. And finally, in part in sort of response largely to Bird's view, I've argued that it should instead be sort of defined in terms of increasing understanding of phenomena. So scientific progress occurs roughly when you increase understanding of phenomena in a sense of understanding that I'll spell out later in more detail, or in some detail. Now, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that so you have to choose between these kinds of accounts or some other account of the sort of what is the cognitive achievement that is sort of at the heart of scientific progress. But in addition to that, there is, I think, this other question that needs to be addressed as well, which is sort of, roughly speaking, whose cognitive achievements is it that determine scientific progress? I mean, is it just some scientist that needs to have knowledge or understanding or solve a problem or whatever it is, or is it someone else? And in fact, how many scientists and stuff like that? So those kinds of questions, I think, raise a different kind of divide or a different kind of way of dividing up the different views about what scientific progress consists in. And the way I like to think about it is that there's kind of a by whom and a for whom perspective here. And where the by whom is kind of the standard view, and I prefer kind of a for whom view. And the standard by whom view or conception says that an episode is scientifically progressive just in case the agents by whom scientific progress is made, so that is to say, usually the scientists themselves, or maybe the scientists in some particular subfield or even a group or a lab or something like that, when they undergo the required type of cognitive improvement, so when they have more knowledge, or when they increase their understanding, etc., etc. And Niiinluoto, I think, sort of accidentally, I think, in a paper, sort of commits himself to this explicitly. So on this view, and in fact, this was my view until quite recently. I mean, in that case, I just sort of tacitly assumed it, or sort of maybe implicitly. And so, on my original formulation of this noetic account, I took it that science progresses when scientists come to have more understanding than they did before. So you just kind of look at the scientists and do they understand more than they did before. So more recently, I've come to think that this can't quite be right, and instead that we should be thinking of scientific progress in this kind of for whom conception way, where you say that some episode is scientifically progressive just in case it puts the relevant members of society, maybe that includes scientists of course, but it might also include a lot of non-scientists, depending a little bit on what kind of result we're talking about. It puts them in a position to acquire or modify the requisite type of cognitive attitude. So it's sort of a cognitive achievement that's sort of shared or shareable with a wider, or at least in principle, shareable with a wider group of people than just those who make scientific progress. So on a version of the noetic account in which you sort of take this point into account, you'd say that science progresses when the relevant members of society are put in a position to increase their understanding. And that would mainly happen through publications and other public channels, that sort of thing, yeah.
Could you specify what you mean by relevant members of society?
Yeah, I mean, that's very much sort of the the thing that is kind of, I guess it's a sort of a parameter in the account that would need to be specified, I think, in different cases. And it is very difficult to say something very precise here, because on the one hand, I mean, you might want to say, just in case it puts anyone in society, I mean, just anyone in a position to acquire or modify the requisite type of cognitive attitudes. And I'm sort of sympathetic to that view in a way, but there are also cases in which obviously what really matters is that, say, medical professionals have access to certain results, for example, or certain things. So I'm trying to be sort of intentionally vague here on this, such that the for whom conception is not sort of as such tied to any particular answer on that or any particular position on that issue. But yeah, you can have more and less extreme versions, I guess, of the for whom conception, depending on who gets counted as the relevant members of society. But that's the basic idea. Yeah. So yeah, so intentionally vague in a way, at least sort of in the abstract. So okay, so then I think you can say sort of this updated noetic account with the for whom conception inside of it would say roughly that an episode E constitutes scientific progress on a given phenomenon X, just in case, and in fact to the extent that it puts relevant members of society in a position to increase their understanding of this phenomenon X. One thing that I haven't mentioned is that I also think that we need to kind of relativize scientific progress to a given sort of phenomenon or topic or question, something along those lines, whereas this is not usually how things are done in the literature on scientific progress, but I think it doesn't really make sense to kind of talk about scientific progress just kind of overall. I think we need to specify we're talking about scientific progress on a particular topic or phenomenon, and I think in a way people are tacitly doing that in many of the case studies and examples that are being used in this literature. Anyway, so I mean, this doesn't tell you very much unless you know what I mean by understanding. And so I have a different paper where I spell it out in much more detail, and I'm sort of building on that paper, where basically the account in this, and this is the paper about the nature of understanding, at least in this context, and the idea here is that someone understands some phenomenon X to the extent that they, first of all, accurately, and second of all, comprehensively represent the network of dependence relations in which this phenomenon stands or fails to stand into other things. So the basic idea is you have an understanding of a system or a phenomenon when you can trace its dependencies and the lack of those dependencies between it and other objects or other things. So sort of it ties understanding to explanation in a sense, because you might want to say that there's a kind of a standard view that says that, you know, in order for something to explain something else, there needs to be this kind of dependence relation between the two things. So one sort of prominent, maybe the central way in which you would gain understanding is by sort of learning an explanation. But that's not necessarily the only way to do so, and I think in a way I'm sort of divorcing a little bit explanation and understanding in this account, because I don't define understanding in terms of explanation, unlike what many other people do. So to me, it's not, understanding is not defined as something that you get from explanation. It's sort of, if anything, if there's any kind of definitional relation between the two, it's probably the other way around, I think. But anyway, that's how I understand this notion, and I'm going to make a few points about this, things that follow and don't follow from this account. First, one thing that does follow from it is that progress is sort of, in a general sense, is kind of factive. That is to say, it's sort of, you have to be right when you have understanding. You can't have a completely and utterly false or fictional theory or something like that and have a great deal of understanding of something. But there's still a sense in which sort of it allows for some falsehoods, in that it may be that in order to increase the comprehensiveness of the representation you have of a network of dependence relations, you need to introduce some idealizations, for example. So things that you know and you take yourself to be false. And so in that sense, there's a sort of it's a slightly weaker, factive in a slightly weaker sense, in that it can be that you increase your understanding by introducing something that you know to be false. So that's why idealizations come into the picture, basically. On the other hand, there's no requirement in this definition of progress or of understanding that scientists themselves sort of have any particular beliefs, really, or in particular, it's not required that they believe the scientific theories in virtue of which we make progress. That's not to say that they're required not to believe them, they just don't, sort of their beliefs don't really come into the picture at all. What needs to be the case is that relevant members of society are put in a position to increase their understanding. And that, of course, could, I mean, the relevant members of society include the scientists, so they would have to be in a position to increase their understanding, but really the beliefs kind of fall out of the picture as slightly irrelevant, although they might sort of have causal effects, of course, on whether you understand or whether people are put in a position to understand. And finally, and this is an important point for certain debates in the about progress, is that this doesn't require that scientists have justification for or knowledge of the content of progressive theory. So you don't have to have justification or knowledge in order to make progress. Although again, it's not you're not banned from having justification or knowledge, and that's all great when you can have it. It's just not part of what it is to make progress on a particular topic. That's a kind of a point for the epistemologists. Okay, so with that in hand, I'm going to sort of present kind of three challenges, just because I want to return to these challenges then in the last section, where I'll argue that sort of this notion of promoting scientific progress are going to help with these challenges. And these are fairly common challenges in the literature. So the first one being what I call the pluralist challenge, which is that I'm going to pose it as a question. It says that aren't there many other types of scientific progress besides, for example, increasing understanding or putting people in a position to increase their understanding, even of this kind of cognitive kind to which we've sort of narrowed the debate? For example, improvements in scientific methods, classification schemes, and formalisms of various sorts. Aren't those also cognitive scientific progress, no less than putting people in a position to increase their understanding? So that's one kind of challenge. Another kind of challenge is I call it sort of the evidentialist challenge, which says that in particular, isn't the gathering of more and better scientific evidence, conducting experiments and making observations and the like, doesn't that also constitute progress, in addition to putting people in a position to understand or something like that? And doesn't my account, the noetic account, sort of exclude that from being progress in a very problematic way, you might think, because what is more scientific than gathering evidence? And finally, what I call the accessibility challenge says that doesn't scientific progress have to be, in some sense, epistemically accessible to the scientists themselves in order to guide their rational decision-making in science? So this is a point made by Rowbottom historically, and also in a recent paper by Jacobs de Genga, who kind of pushing this line that if the notion of progress is supposed to be of some use to scientists themselves, they need to be in a position to assess whether a given something that they might do is going to lead to progress or not, and that leads them to be both of Stegenga and Rowbottom then become kind of non-factualists. They think that progress can't be of a factive kind because we don't know beforehand whether something will lead to progress, and we might even know it after the fact either, if it has to be factive. Okay, so I'll return to these challenges in the last section. Okay, so how much time do I have? 15 minutes at least, maybe 30? Is that okay?
So we have 1 hour left in total, so it depends on
how
much discussion.
Okay. So just in terms of background, before I sort of start talking about promoting scientific progress, I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about what's been said about promoting scientific progress and how, I guess, then how my stuff that I want to say about it relates to that. So there's the notion of promoting progress is kind of starts really with Darrell Rowbottom in this in a 2008 paper where he's responding to Bird's account, epistemic account, and he said it doesn't really matter what the example is that he's using, but he's kind of considering an objection according to which a specific event would, according to him, only have, or according to this objection, not according to him, only have been responsible for progress and not constituted progress. So you can sort of, he's kind of making a distinction there between being responsible for progress and constituting progress, and then you kind of get Bird's response to this in a sort of an immediate response in the same journal. He says, in fact, that Rowbottom anticipates this response, that, and he puts it differently. He says, well, the event would have caused progress but not constituted it. And then actually on the same page, he kind of reiterates the point by using this language of promotion. He says, we must distinguish what constitutes progress from what promotes it. And so that's where I'm borrowing this term promoting. I mean, I could have used, I suppose, some of these other terms. I just think this is the most general way of putting it. And I also have kind of picked up on this, and I'm just showing you that, yeah, I'm sort of part of these people who have kind of been using this notion of promotion of progress, but none of us, including me, really spell out what we mean by promotion of progress. And so that's what I want to basically get to in this paper. And so I'm as guilty of not spelling it out as our Bird and Rowbottom, I think. Although I did say, I guess, in some other paper that it facilitates or leads to. That's why that's my gloss on what promotion of progress is supposed to be. So there's some sort of distinction here that's being referred to between constituting and, in some sense, promoting progress that we want to try to capture. And then I want to give an account of the latter in particular. And one way to make the distinction is in terms of the aim or aims of science. This seems to be Bird's approach in an earlier article, where he seems to suggest that you can say that something constitutes scientific progress if it partially achieves the aims of science. So, I mean, according to him, the aim of science is just knowledge, it's just having more knowledge. And so partially achieving that would just be, yes, I mean, the aim is knowledge, then partially achieving it would just have to have a piece of knowledge, I guess, that you didn't have before. Whereas promoting scientific progress in this way of looking at it would just be something that, you know, facilitates or leads to, in some sense, to be specified, the achievement or the partial achievement of the aims of science. So it doesn't quite achieve it, but it leads to it being achieved at some later point. And so that's one way to distinguish them, and I think an alternative way that I've been more inclined to use in my more recent papers on this is to kind of distinguish it roughly as you distinguish intrinsic value, say, in metaethics from instrumental values. So some things are good in themselves, and some things are good only only insofar as they get you the things that are good in themselves. I mean, in order for anything to be good or valuable instrumentally, of course, there needs to be something that isn't good instrumentally, because otherwise there would be an infinite chain of things that are instrumentally good for the sake of something else. So that's kind of where the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value comes from, and you might think that's kind of the same distinction as the one between constituting and promoting progress. So, or it's an analogous one. So on this picture, you'd say, you know, some event constitutes scientific progress if it is a scientific improvement, sort of irrespective of what other change it facilitates or leads to at some later times, whereas it promotes scientific progress if it's a scientific improvement only insofar as it facilitates or leads to other scientific improvements at some later times. But this still doesn't, of course, spell out what it is to facilitate or lead to. It's just a way of making the distinction, given that you have some idea of what that means. Maybe I'll just skip this, in fact. This is a bit inside baseball. It's just a bit of an issue about, maybe I'll just say this quickly. There's been some development, in particular Bird, because he's kind of an important player, and sort of using, I'm mentioning this. Bird wrote a book recently, a 2022 book, where he is sort of carving things up a bit differently, where he's kind of saying, actually, or his view at least implies that there are two different kinds of progress, two different things that constitute progress. The thing that achieve the aim of science and the thing that promote the aim of science. So in this view, you don't really have a distinction between achieving, you don't really have a distinction between constituting and promoting progress, but you do have a distinction between two kinds of progress, namely the achieving and the promoting kind, the kind that achieves the aim and the kind that promotes the aim. So this really turns out to be more or less a notational variant on the earlier distinction. You still have a distinction, which is exactly the distinction that you need to account for. It just is called something a little bit different. So for this reason, I'll just sort of proceed as if even Bird is making a distinction between promoting and constituting progress, although he might put it in different terms, I guess, in what I have to say in the rest of the talk. Okay, so yeah, so this brings me to the question, which is the way that I want to put the question is just that I want to try to answer them in the rest of the talk is what exactly is it for some episode to promote scientific progress? And that's what with this clause facilitate or lead to scientific progress, the way I put it before. And the alternative way to ask the question, if you prefer this kind of Bird's view of setting things up, you would ask, what is it for some episode to promote the achievement of the aim of science? Promotes or rather than constitute, I guess, the achievement of the aim of science. That is to say, we call it the progress P rather than progress A. What is this progress P thing that we, this kind of progress that would involve promoting the aim of science. And the approach that I'll take is to take some inspiration and also some sort of theoretical machinery from actually kind of a very different debate that I've also contributed to by some sort of coincidence, I think, where there's this recent discussion of what it is for an action to promote a desire. In a way that you then have, because the action would promote a desire that you have a reason to perform the action in virtue of the action promoting your desire. So if you have a desire for coffee, you going into a coffee shop and paying for a cup of it is a way to promote that, right? And such that you have a practical reason to go into the coffee shop, etc., insofar as you have the desire. So that's where, and this in particular, the account that I'm inspired, especially by, is in turn inspired by sort of expected utility theory in decision theory. Okay, so let's get to that. So this is the account, or in some ways there's going to be two accounts that I'll talk about of promoting scientific progress. So. So first, a kind of a preliminary point to set things up. So I think, you might disagree with this, and I'd be interested to hear if you do. I think a sort of a complete account, account that sort of does everything that an account of scientific progress should do for us, needs to say not just whether there is progress in a given episode, not just that was progress, that wasn't progress. It also needs to say how much progress there was in a given episode. So it needs to kind of basically, and the reason I have for this is that if you don't have an account that does that much, you couldn't really compare how much progress was made in one episode as opposed to another, or you couldn't estimate in particular how worthwhile in terms of progress. Suppose progress is your only aim, scientific progress, then you want to estimate, for example, how worthwhile is it to pursue this particular research project rather than not do it, rather than spend your time on something else. And I think an account of progress, if it's worth anything, ought to be able to give us answers to these sorts of questions. It shouldn't just say there was progress here and there wasn't progress there, because that's more or less, almost completely uninformative about how, for example, to distribute limited resources if you're trying to make progress and stuff like that. So, for this sort of reason, I think ultimately any sort of complete or adequate account of scientific progress should really provide us with a measure of progress, which would then be sort of a function from a function rho from possible episodes and combinations of possible episodes to the real numbers or something along those lines, which would then sort of represent the amount of progress. And if you have, say, if you have more than 0 on this measure, you'd have some progress. If you have 0, then you'd have just stagnation, you'd have no progress or regress. And then if you have, if you have a negative output of your progress function, then you have regress. So you could also then get instances in which you make you regress scientifically according to this progress measure. So yeah, and so with that sort of a progress measure in hand, you could judge, for example, that one episode constitutes more progress than another. According to, say, the noetic account, if the noetic account has an associated progress measure Pn, according to which this is the case. So stuff like that you could say if you had a progress measure row for each account. And so I'll assume that we can formulate these accounts of scientific progress, or at least sort of ideally we ought to be able to do so using a progress measure like this. So with that in mind, I think we can sort of have a first pass of a definition of or an account of what promotion would amount to. And you could just say something along the following lines, and I'll revise this later on in response to some problems, but say something along the lines of like an episode E promotes scientific progress to the extent that the subsequent development of science, so the having done E or E having happened, that development of science subsequently is more progressive than the subsequent development would have been otherwise. That is to the extent that the output of the measure for DE exceeds the output of the measure for DO, where DO is what would happen, development that would have happened otherwise.
Is O just not B?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in the account that I'll give you, the actual account, that's not really going to arise, I think. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, is it a development in which E certainly does not happen, or is it a development that I suppose E would have happened anyway?
Or other things happen instead?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit unclear what the other things are, right? So that's I mean, this is one of the problems. In fact, I'm just going to kind of click to that now. So I mean, the problem is, I guess maybe this is the exact same problem, or maybe it's just a related problem. But anyway, I mean, to me, the main problem is that the future development of science from some episode, or the lack of that episode happening, is just not a single thing. It could be different things. I mean, it's in a sense, that's where I put it, it's sort of metaphysically and or epistemically open what the development of science is from a given episode, or the negation or the lack of that episode, or something like that. So there's not like a single episode, or it's not a single development that results from a given episode E, nor, and maybe more obviously, is there a single development that would have occurred otherwise. In fact, instead there are many such developments. So I think the sort of obvious fix here, or not obvious fix, but at least a possible fix, is to say you should, instead of considering what would definitely have happened in each case, you consider how much progress is to be expected in each case. So you basically say, you can define a notion of expectation of progress, which is sort of, you just have the progress measure, and then you multiply that by the probability of that development occurring given the episode, and then you sum up over all the possible developments. And then you do likewise in the case of otherwise, but of course then you don't conditionalize on E happening. So this is kind of just, what would you on average expect to happen regardless of E, or sort of not given E, and what would you on average expect to happen given that E does happen?
Maybe you come to this, but do you think the probability here is an epistemic probability?
Yeah, and I'm going to get exactly that issue. Yeah, exactly. So let me just formulate this account first, but yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, here's sort of the second pass, and that doesn't answer your question, but I'm going to get to that. So the first second pass then says, like, well, you say that an episode promotes scientific progress to the extent that the probability weight, and I'm not going to tell you anything at this point what the probability is, but the probability weighted sum of the amount of progress in each possible subsequent development of science is higher than it would have been otherwise. That is to the extent that this expectation exceeds this expectation. So the expectation conditional on E exceeds the expectation not conditional on E. There are certain things that I'm going to sort of leave open because I think they involve, answering questions that don't really matter at all for what I'll be saying in this talk. But I mean, so one thing that I'll leave open is how to spell out this kind of notion of to the extent that something exceeds something else. So that's what I say here, to the extent that this exceeds that. I mean, these are both numbers, and to the extent that something exceeds something, that's not a very precise way of putting it. You could measure that by taking the difference between this and that. You could take the ratio of that to this, and the log ratio, which is in some ways formally nicer. I mean, these kind of options are actually familiar from the measurements of confirmation literature, if anyone of you are familiar with that. But this is kind of just a technical issue. It won't really make any difference for me because I won't be relying on so sensitive judgments about what this amounts to. But that's kind of, yeah. So those are things, I guess, to be worked out if you want to have a really precise account of promotion. And I also want, and this is more of a substantial question, I suppose, but I'm not going to, in this talk at least, take a stand on whether maybe the conditional probability of a development given E should instead sort of inspired by causal decision theory as opposed to evidential decision theory, maybe you should replace that with the probability that E causes the development. So this kind of probability where this is a sort of causal arrow. So maybe that's a better way. If you like causal decision theory, you'll probably like that version of the second pass of the promotion definition better. Yeah.
So could you say a little bit more about the difference ratio? How exactly would that implement the exceeds?
Oh, I mean, the idea is just that the ratio of this to this would be a number, right?
Yeah.
So to the extent that this exceeds this, right? So the extent that this is higher than this, the ratio is going to be higher. So you sort of measure the exceedingness of this over that by the ratio, or alternatively just by subtracting one from the other.
But in that sense, don't all of them capture exactly the same thing? Like one of the numbers is larger than the other?
Well, in all cases, you're always going to get the I mean, if these were just like a binary judgment, like if this said, i.e., if this exceeds that, then you'd be right. But if you're going to measure the extent to which, right, so the extent to which you have scientific progress, then, and it's been shown in this measures of confirmation literature, that these measures, where you do these different types of measures, they're not ordinarily equivalent. Unfortunately, so it's a kind of you have to choose between them if you're going to be really precise. So this actually kind of matters in the confirmation literature. Certain issues about confirmation turn on whether you have this kind of measure of confirmation or this or that. I'm personally a big fan of this, but you know, it's sort of it gets quite involved arguments for using one of these mathematical measures. I guess one of the other, yeah. Okay, so. So that's kind of the second pass, but then, is it Tim? I think, Tim, your question really starts to matter, which is, well, what is this probability? I mean, probability is just a mathematical notion. I mean, you need an interpretation of a probability in order for it really to take any meaning in this context. So, and the way I like to kind of motivate this, the need for interpretation of this probability is by considering kind of what I call like a tricky case. So suppose you have a scientist, they call her S, who rationally believes, stipulate that she rationally believes, that some possible episode E, S, for example, her conducting a particular experiment, suppose she rationally believes that it's extremely likely to result in a great deal of progress on some particular topic. But in fact, unfortunately, unknown to her, through no fault of her own, etc., the experiment is just bound to fail. There's something off with the experiment. It's just not going to work. And so, as a matter of fact, although she believes otherwise rationally, it's not going to lead to any progress as a matter of fact, right? And so, then you can ask yourself the question: so what should we say? Does performing this experiment, does it promote progress or doesn't it? And here I think you can sort of go in both directions. You can see arguments pro and con. So on the one hand, given this person's rational credences, it seems like she should certainly expect progress to occur. So this would be, if we kind of replace the probability now with a credence measure, which is S's credence measure, which we assume to be probabilistically coherent because she's rational, this would be kind of the inequality it seems that we would have, namely that the expectation of progress is greater given this event than without it. On the other hand, and sort of I'm just assuming that the case is such that if we're thinking of these as sort of the probabilities here as objective chances, then the inequality would be reversed, because after all, this particular experiment is bound to fail, right? It's not going to work. And so, in fact, at best, I suppose, the objective chances of progress being made in the future are no better than before, and perhaps even maybe worse, because now this scientist has spent all this time on this experiment, and maybe even it gets you some results, and it misleads lots of scientists in the future until they correct it, etc., etc. So that's a entirely conceivable type of situation. And so these measures within, these interpretations of the probabilities involved in the expectations, they really start to matter, and they come apart in this way. So here, I think, one response to this sort of tricky case would be to say, this is the correct interpretation, and that's the incorrect interpretation. That's not how I would like to take this. I would just want to say there are two kinds of sort of notions of promotion here, and they're both sort of legitimate, and we should recognize both. So the idea is basically you kind of split the account into two, and you have an account of subjective promotion. Maybe that's not the best term for it. That's what I'm going to call it for now. And then you say sort of an episode subjectively promotes scientific progress relative then to a particular credence function. And it does that to the extent that the credence-weighted sum of the amount of progress in each possible subsequent development of science is higher than it would have otherwise been. That is, to the extent that this expectation, a kind of a credence-based expectation, exceeds, conditional on E, exceeds the one that isn't conditional on E. And then you just add another notion of promotion, which is more objective. So you say that an episode E objectively promotes scientific progress to the extent that the chance-weighted sum of the amount of progress in each possible subsequent development of science is higher than it would have been otherwise. And then you're comparing then this expectation, where this is kind of an objective expectation, or sort of an expectation, what you would expect if you knew what the objective chances were, given E and not given E. And then perhaps in a deterministic case, this would just reduce to a case in which something like this exceeds something else, but it's I'm still a little bit nervous about this, because I'm not sure what this even means to say that the development that would otherwise occur if E had not occurred. So maybe, I'm sort of a little bit worried about Christian's question earlier, but something like this presumably would reduce to if you have a deterministic scenario. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, I think a little bit, and draw a lesson from this. So really, if this is right, then we really have not just a two-way distinction between constitution and promotion of progress, but really a kind of a three-way distinction at least. On one hand, we have a notion of something constituting progress. If the progress measure is higher than 0, then you have a notion of objectively promoting progress, and then a notion of subjectively promoting progress, given these kinds of inequalities of the expectations given the event and not. And my contention now is that a complete and a useful account of scientific progress shouldn't sort of try to reduce one of these notions to the other in some way or flatten them, but rather just use all three notions. For example, because we want to say and notice that the first two notions here of constituting and objectively promoting progress, they are both ways for a scientist to, in a sense, contribute to progress. So for them to lead to progress being made either here and now in the actual event, or in some future development of science that is yet to occur. And so they're both very valuable types of contributions to science. They're just slightly different. It's just a matter really of timing and to some extent of probability, whether or how they contribute to progress. And the third notion, by contrast, that's a notion of something that provides the scientist with a subjective reason to try to make the event happen, right? So when you're thinking about how, as a scientist, you ought to behave in order to maximize progress, all you can do, of course, is to make use of the credences that you have rationally got to. And so, from your point of view, what you should be doing is to maximize the extent to which the extent to which you subjectively promote progress, because you don't have access to what objectively promotes progress. That's not a thing that is within your epistemic limits, so to speak. Okay, so maybe I should hurry up a little bit. So in the final section, I just want to kind of show that some of this matter, in particular, the distinction between objectively and subjectively promoting progress, and between those two and constitutional progress, it matters for these challenges, and we can respond to them with these notions in hand. So the pluralist challenge. So here I'm just going over these challenges again. I'm not gonna repeat them to save time, but these are the challenges again, and I'll display each challenge on each slide. So starting with the pluralist challenge, that challenge said, if you recall, that or sort of questioned whether there aren't many other types of scientific progress, even of a cognitive kind. For example, perhaps improvements or novelties in scientific methods, in classifications, and in formalisms. That monistic accounts of scientific progress, like the noetic account, don't count as progress. And I think the right response to this is to say that in almost all cases of new scientific methods being introduced and new classifications being introduced, and certainly in most cases of new formalisms being introduced, it's quite clear that these things kind of objectively promote progress, in that they lead to future progress being made on average, even if they don't constitute it. So in that sense, they contribute to progress, even if they don't constitute progress in the moment. So I think that there's no need to say that these kinds of things constitute progress in order to account for their value to the scientific enterprise. Rather, we can just say that these are the sorts of things that objectively promote progress, and they do so perhaps to a large extent. In fact, some of the greatest advances in science, I think, it have been by proposing new scientific methods that lead to a lot of progress down the line. I'm just going to skip this point, but so that's one response, and it's the most important response, I suppose. But another response is or sort of part two to the response, I guess, is that you have to notice, though, that there are going to be certain, perhaps very rare cases in which these types of things, so new scientific methods, new classifications, and formalisms even, they might hinder progress in certain. I mean, they might objectively dispromote progress in certain cases. They might, for example, by leading scientists into blind alleys. It's not inconceivable that certain cases of new scientific methods being introduced would actually lead to scientists using the wrong kinds of methods and to making less progress than they otherwise would have made. And so some examples of that are sort of fairly obvious. I mean, you could sort of think of the method of consulting scripture. I assume sort of the uptake of that particular method did not objectively promote progress. And another example would be sort of the classification of humans into races. It's not something that objectively promoted progress. So there are instances, and this is just the point, that there are instances of scientific methods, new scientific methods, new classifications, or old ones even, that don't promote progress, and we don't want to count those as progress. And a pluralist, a sort of a thoroughgoing pluralist, it's not clear how they would prevent these kinds of things from counting as progress if they just say, well, I'm just going to be a pluralist about progress, so every new method proposed and every new classification proposed, etc., is going to count as progress. What we want really is a story of which scientific methods and which classifications and which formalisms are the ones that do contribute to progress. And that's the kind of story that is provided by an account of promotion in combination with an account of what constitutes progress. Whereas a pluralist account just does not do that. It just fails to give us any kind of story about which scientific methods, classifications, and formalisms do contribute to progress and which don't. And in light of the fact that there are, I think, manifestly cases in which they don't contribute to progress, that's the kind of story that we need. Yeah, so here I'm just kind of displaying sort of how the picture looks like on a sort of a noetic account combined with an account on which there's also promotional progress. On this picture, we have methods, not all of them, but I assume most of them, and classification schemes, not all of them, but I assume most of them, and formalisms, maybe all of those, but I guess conceivably at least not all of them. They all promote progress in virtue of promoting sort of shareable understanding on the noetic account, and it's in virtue of that they, when they do promote progress, that they contribute to progress, and that's the value of them. Whereas the picture on a sort of thoroughgoing pluralistic picture would have to kind of put all these things sort of in a line, and they all constitute progress in some way, but that's just not a plausible picture in light of the fact that not all of these things do contribute to progress, I think. Okay, so that's the first challenge. Now the second challenge is what I call the evidential challenge. It's really kind of, in a way, quite related to the pluralist challenge. It asks, doesn't the gathering of more and better scientific evidence, for example, through reliable experiment, doesn't that also constitute progress? And again, my answer here is going to be quite similar. I'm going to say, well, first of all, generally, of course, more and better evidence objectively promotes progress, maybe like nothing else does, really, in science, because it leads to more accurate and more comprehensive representations of phenomena. So the reason why evidence is valuable is in virtue of what it sort of gets us down the line, namely a better representation of phenomena. Now, so that's the first response. The second response is that, again, sort of mirroring the last slide, is that in certain rare cases, though, you could have scientific evidence which is misleading, right? So you could have evidence, for example, if you just look at the colors of swans in Europe, I guess before 1600 or something like that, you might have thought that all swans are white, and so the evidence of the colors of swans observed in Europe is quite misleading of the actual colors of all swans. There are also cases like the Piltdown Man, probably heard of a kind of fabricated evidence, which is also quite misleading as to the lineage of human species. So there are cases of misleading evidence that we would have been better without, that we would have obtained more progress had we not collected that evidence. And so a good account of scientific progress should distinguish cases in which distinguish the type of evidence that does actually contribute to progress from the type of evidence that doesn't. And if you just say in a kind of pluralistic spirit, or in the spirit of, say, the epistemic account of Bert, that every instance of evidence is an instance of progress, then you can't make that type of judgment. So I think a story on which evidence promotes progress is actually better than a story on which it also constitutes progress. Maybe I'll just skip this. Yeah, and finally go to what I call the accessibility challenge. So here the challenge is the question: doesn't scientific progress have to be epistemically accessible to scientists themselves in order to guide rational decision making in science. And here my answer is going to be a little bit different. The point here is that with an account of subjective promotion, we can sort of address this concern, I think, even better than, say, the problem-solving account of scientific progress, which is sort of supposedly designed to address this sort of kind of concern. So the point is that even in a factive account of scientific progress, which has a measure of progress that is factive, it can guide decision making through stating basically that progress-seeking scientists should do what maximizes subjective promotion of progress rather than objective promotion. That is, it should maximize the extent to which different actions would increase future progress in their own estimations, right? So according to, given their own credences, to do what maximizes increases increases in expected progress given those. This would be, I think, a completely. There would be no issue of sort of these kinds of things not being able to guide rational decision making, because kind of the subjective estimations of future progress of the sort that goes into an account of what maximizes subjective promotion of progress, well, those are surely, I think, no less epistemically accessible than, for example, the extent to which some episode would solve or eliminate seemingly important problems of the sort that Laudon and Kuhn are interested in. So Laudon, he thinks, we can sort of somehow figure out, we have sort of epistemic access to the extent to which a given development, I suppose, would solve or eliminate problems that are deemed to be important by the research tradition. But if you kind of think about it, that's not such an not such an easy thing to have access to, because you have to kind of estimate how the research tradition of which you're a part would judge this problem to be solved or not solved, and how important it would judge this problem to be. And those sorts of things do not seem to be the sorts of things that we have easy access to, whereas it seems that we have much easier access to, if anything, our own subjective estimations of future progress. So yeah, so that's my final point here, that if anything, the notion of subjective progress promotion is I think, better suited to guide rational decisions than Laudon's own notion of progress, which is supposedly designed to do precisely that. Okay, so that's where I'll end.
All right, thanks. We have 25 minutes for discussions. Yes, I guess we have a lot of questions, so I will start. Can I?
You're the chair.
Okay, so I'm going to start. So I like the overall proposal. I like your noetic account. I was wondering whether some of the challenges you are fighting with are not premised on a wrong assumption, which would be that it's possible to promote scientific regress. Right? So you just have that, but I have a bit of a hard time to see what it could be, because another option would be to say, okay, because you can compare different events, and you could say that, let's say we invest a lot of money building a lot of experiments, they don't give good results, and people will start complaining that it was not a good use of the money, we should have done something else.
Yeah.
You could say, okay, so that was promoting scientific regress, something like that. But better analysis would be that it was not the best use of the money. And so I'm wondering whether it's what is the case in science, that you can have more or less, you can have better way to promote science, but you never have any way to really promote regress. There is no way to promote scientific regress. And that might be different from philosophy, where because then maybe you might initiate some bad set of ideas that people will spend time looking at.
Yeah.
But I think it's science, even if we have your noetic account and we think it should be available for understanding the data, knowing that all those negative experiments happened and gave negative results, or those attempts at using those methodologies that didn't work out, it seems it could be used to build kind of to promote scientific understanding. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I agree with the point that, I mean, when we're most worried about scientific progress, or when people criticize, say, the fact that so much money was spent on a particular type of experiment or something like that, or so much time just on a particular theory being developed or something like that, it's usually not because they are worried that there was going to be some sort of huge regress in scientific, so the opposite of scientific progress in that. It's usually, as you said, I think, because there wasn't as much progress as we could have made had we used those same resources for some other thing, right? So that's, in fact, I mean, I totally agree with that, and that's why I think it's not a great setup to argue about, is there scientific progress or isn't there? Or even less, is there scientific progress or is there scientific regress? Those are two coarse-grained kind of categories to be arguing about. What we need to have is an account of the extent to which we make progress in different episodes, and then also the extent to which we might promote scientific progress in different ways, right? So I just totally agree with that point. But I do think it's possible, although it's not common, for there to be scientific regress. I mean, it's not. I mean, we're now at the sort of in the age of scientific progress, I suppose. But you know, it's happened historically. You know, there was a certain amount of knowledge, and then you know the library of Alexandria burned down, and things like that. I mean, there were moments in history in which we went a little bit backwards, I think, in terms of our understanding, I guess, of the world, and I guess maybe on any of the accounts of knowledge progress we have. What do you think?
No, I mean, if the library burns, I don't think it's the same kind of setback. It's not like a cognitive setback, right?
Okay, but I mean, what if the library burned down and everyone died with it, and then you just have to start from scratch? You know, after, I mean, you'd have to kind of, I guess you'd have to resort to hypothetical scenarios now, but it's not inconceivable that you'd have regress.
That would be a scientific regress. But just wondering, because at the beginning you distinguish between different sorts of scientific progress with cognitive progress and other sorts, and I just wonder how to. But fair enough. I'm just wondering, trying to find a way to use those negative values in your metric.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought, okay, that might be useful in philosophy.
Okay.
But in science, I find it more difficult to find clear cases. But anyway, sure.
No, but I mean, I agree. I think that's not a common or reasonable worry to have. I guess that there's certainly going to be.
Because I mean, if we are liberal and we accept that negative results are results, they matter a lot.
Yeah.
So Sylvia, you want to start?
Yes, thanks. So I start with Finnur, maybe a more advanced question. I was wondering, because in the idea of progress, we in the scientific domain, but also in moral domain or organic domain, we look at what happened over a time span, and we try to make sense of the intuition that, for example, we compare time 1 and time 1000, and we try to make sense of the intuition that at time 1000 something is better. But I think that, so we agree that there is no necessity in this betterment, and there is nothing deterministic in it. So I cannot, my question was about your motivation. Is the idea that we can learn a lesson about what has promoted scientific progress in the past, and so say maybe we can have some clues about to what project give fundings, or is this your motivation?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think an account of progress is needed to make sort of informed, or at least philosophically informed decisions about, say, which sort of research funding, or which research projects, like I say, a funding body should fund. I mean, in fact, they have some sort of implicit account, I think, in mind. and of course people have different accounts, and you have these panels, etc., etc. But ultimately, I think a project like this should have to inform those sorts of decisions. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
definitely.
Because my worry is that, I mean, this could be completely open. Something that has worked in the past may lead nowhere. I mean,
right,
there is no reason why necessarily what worked before. I mean, and on the other side, wonderful discovery may take place, and that we were not expecting it, and we.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that. Yeah, so I didn't really answer the first part of your question, I suppose, which was sort of, can we do a kind of simple induction from the past to the future, where we say this is what led to progress in the past. Let's do that again. No, I mean, that's of course problematic just for the sorts of reasons that most of, you can't make any very simple inductive arguments in sort of about very complex systems like human and social science. So I mean, if you'd wanted to do that sort of thing, I suppose you'd have to do things just in a more systematic way. And it's not inconceivable that you could do this, that you could find correlations that are actually somewhat stable across time, and therefore a better ground for sort of an inductive argument of that kind. I wasn't primarily, it never really occurred to me actually to do that, what you're suggesting. I was thinking more in terms of, we want an account of progress, for example, in order to say, if we're evaluating different funding proposals, and we can tell beforehand that this particular project, for example, would, like, even if it were to be successful in what it says it's going to do, it would still not lead to any progress, according to an account. I mean, so that's the kind of thing, just in the extreme, right, that you could use an account of progress to do for you. Right, so that sort of thing, yeah.
Thank you. May I ask another short question, or wait? Yes. The other is, you said at some point that your account of progress concerns a given phenomenon rather than the overall scientific progress. And I agree with you, in the literature it is rather this second sense, because I think the intuition is that we want to be able to compare, say, Aristotle and contemporary physics, and say that there has been an overall progress. And so do you think we should give up thinking that over history of science a global progress have occurred? Or, I mean, you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, so to relativize to a particular topic or phenomenon isn't necessarily to give up on that. You could just say, well, we can ask about a specific phenomenon, we can also ask about the entire universe or something like that, and then it becomes this kind of global progress notion. But my point is just, often we want to compare, for example, how much progress was made by Newton on gravitation in this period versus had there been no Newton or something like that. And we're not really in a thought experiment, for example, like that. We're not really comparing how much progress was there overall for Newton and all the other scientists on all other projects, etc. So it's just, I was just really, it's more of a technical point about how to conduct the debate, I guess, about scientific progress than I guess a commentary on whether we can measure progress sort of overall. But yeah, I'm hoping that we could, in principle, do both. But of course, in practice, I guess the second thing is more or less impossible.
Okay, thank you so much.
Right. Mehdi?
Thank you. I have a question about the probabilities and the possible developments.
Yeah.
Arguably to get a grip on both of these, you need to set some kind of modal context or some kind of modality in mind. Because I think, as you said, metaphysically, any kind of development is possible for science. And arguably, as you make the context narrower, the possible developments will get narrower, and the credences, or sorry, maybe not the credences, but the chances might get different as well. So, what do you think would be like the appropriate modal context for science in this sense, if there is such a matter of fact?
Are you sort of wondering how we narrow down the possible developments over which we're averaging, I guess, in this? Okay. okay, so tell me why this doesn't work, or if it doesn't work. So why not just say we just have all the possible, no narrowing. It's just that the probabilities of some of these developments is going to be low, or even zero, I suppose. Like, so those they don't get excluded in the sense that they get an I in the numbering of the DIs, right? But they just don't get any probability, so they don't affect the overall kind of result of it. I mean, there might be the only issues I can see with that would be something about, you know, infinities that go beyond kind of countable infinity, I suppose. Because you might think if you have an uncountable infinity, then it's going to be hard to kind of sum that up or something like that. But I think there would kind of be technical problems of that sort of nature rather than any. Right? Yeah.
Sure, I guess that there would be a technical intricacy, but arguably also like one of these developments would be completely irrelevant, right? Or I mean, maybe we shouldn't take interest in that. I don't know.
Right, but if they get a non-zero probability, right, then shouldn't we take an interest in them? I mean, to the extent that if they do get a non-zero probability, we should take an interest in them. If they get a zero probability, then sure, yeah, we shouldn't take an interest in them, right? But it's sort of the idea is to kind of build all that sort of the relevance of, into the probability function rather than to kind of narrow it down before the function is applied to those possibilities.
From you?
Just a second point, I guess that depends on where you take the probability from.
Yeah.
So if you take the probability to be defined ultimately by physics, maybe, then you effectively restrict by setting the probability zero for all the metaphysical but not physical possibilities from your starting point, you effectively restrict the set of the model space.
Yeah.
By
yeah.
procedure. So.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So that would be a natural way of saying which get a probability zero. They're just the ones that are not physically possible, even though they may be metaphysically or logically possible, etc. Yeah. Okay.
Charlotte, you had a question?
No.
Or Martha? No?
Yeah. No.
Okay, so...
I think it was Lorenzo.
Yeah, but please go
No.
yourself. Okay. So here, no other questions? Is there any...
I think there were many more hands.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I thought you raised your hand. Or someone raised your hand.
Team raised.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so go for it.
No, but Lorenzo, I think was first.
Yeah, well, I'm not following time here.
Okay. Question about the measure.
Okay.
Sorry, kind of stupid question, of course. I mean, where do you take the measure from, right? Ultimately, right?
Yeah.
You have some ideas, which you say in certain concrete application settings, you have a good sense of what could be this measure, or ultimately you would be fine with saying the measure is just a stand-in for after whole equivalence class of measures. Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I was worried someone was gonna. I mean, the idea is just you would need a measure like that in order to be able to say to what extent a given episode is progressive. If you just take, like for any episode, right?
Yeah.
Indeed, any combination of episodes, you'd need a measure like that. So the idea is, I mean, perhaps no actual account of scientific progress that has been proposed gives you this measure, right? Because it's such a precise thing, of course, and you know, the accounts we have, they're inevitably kind of imprecise in the way that most of philosophy tends to be. But in principle, that's what it's supposed to give us. So in principle, it's okay to take this, to assume that we have this measure if we're going to give an account of promotion that is anyway parasitic on an account of what constitutes progress, right? So that's the kind of setup here. Like I'm assuming we have already an account of what constitutes progress, and I guess I'm adding, and I'm assuming also that it's complete, right? So that we can construct this kind of measure. Of course, I mean, if we never get from the stage, I mean, and if it's sort of somehow conceptually impossible to have a complete account, and therefore conceptually impossible to have this kind of measure, then that would be a problem, I think, for the resulting account of promotion of progress. But my thinking is there's nothing wrong with assuming first that we have already kind of solved this issue of how to make the account of progress complete, and then add that onto, or so use that then in an account of what promotes progress.
Right.
In fact, it would be weird if we could somehow first give an account of what promotes progress that is somehow independent of what the account of progress itself is, right? So, yeah.
This is all true, but at the same time I would think it's very unlikely to find like one natural candidate for this measure, right, of progress. And so that sense might be more straightforward to first of all formulate your account after all as a qualitative one. And
Qualitative, yeah.
Yeah, and then only in case you really have such a candidate for a natural measure, make it a qualitative one, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know, is it?
Yeah, but then I guess it would sort of be built into also the account of progress promotion that's going to be qualitative as well. And so then it's going to be hard to say things about what promotes progress to greater and lesser extents and that sort of thing, which is sort of what we want the account to do for us. I mean, I think without that, we're just going to have a very impoverished notion.
Maybe takes the other strategy that one looks at more concrete scenarios, say specific context where you can maybe come up with more or less a natural, well-defined measure.
Yeah.
Then you'll be fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I'll think about that. Yeah.
Okay, Charlotte, and then Maestro.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add, because at a certain point you said that understanding is not defined as explanation, it's rather the other way around. If you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think what I said, I think, and I hope I said at least, was that I don't define understanding in terms of explanation, but rather I define it in terms of having a representation of a network of dependence relations. So it's related to explanation. In that I think for most people, to have an explanation is itself to represent these dependence relations, right? In some way, or to perhaps if you use explanation in the sense of a sort of a speech act, which I think is the most natural sense of explanation, then you're just conveying information about this network of dependence relations. So the way that I think of it is like, understanding is a notion we can define regardless of explanation, and then because of that we can, if we like, and I think it's quite natural to do so, to say, well, that explanation is just a speech act that singles out certain information and in this network of dependence relations and conveys that to the hearer, basically. So in this way, I think I should cite here sort of verbally. I should cite Angela Potocznik, who kind of has this view as well. She's written on understanding and explanation. There's a paper called something understanding and explanation, putting communication first, or something like that. So that's how I kind of think of it. In part, of course, because this is not a conclusive reason, but it's one reason is that just the notion of explanation has proved to be so nebulous that it's, for me at least, hard to rely on it in further theorizing. It's like people have so many different views about explanation, and there are apparently different kinds of explanation, and so I prefer not to rely on that in my further theorizing, but rather, sort of, if possible, to kind of avoid it by defining, say, understanding directly in terms of these dependence relations, which may then be related to explanation, or not, depending on what you think. Yeah.
Over time.
I mean, it's 41.
My clock is not like.
So if you can be brief, so you can ask a question, perhaps 15.
Yeah, well, I have a worry and a suggestion. The worry is that the subjective notion of promoting progress is not really an explication of promoting progress. So take your example of, say, put something in the past which did not promote progress. So I say, oh, that X, that parent discovery promoted progress. Then you say, well, did it lead to progress? And you say, well, no, actually, it went to a blind alley for 30 years, and then we put all the resources on that, we found everything else, we burned all the other scientists as heretics, and then we discovered I was wrong, right? Yeah. And I say, in what sense did it promote progress? Well, we thought it would. Right? It doesn't seem to be a an explication of the notion of just having promoted progress. My suggestion was, well, why not just say that if you're worried about the counterfactual account, that to promote progress just is for an episode to cause some other episode which constitutes progress.
Yeah. Okay. So on the first question, first question. So I just kind of agree with that. I mean, that's also my intuition, I guess, about how we ought to use the word promotion. So that's why I think I sort of very briefly said something along that this might not be the right label for it, subjective promotion. So I think maybe something like seem to promote progress or something like that might be a better label for it. So I'll just agree on that point. But that's of course just a terminological point that doesn't really matter that much. Why isn't it just cause progress? I guess in a way, I guess you could say that it is just cause progress insofar as, if causation, if causing something that is kind of a gradable property just is sort of the objective chance, incorporating the objective chance, the expected, the expectation is greater given that event than without it, then I guess I would be happy to say that it is kind of causation. But I guess that, to me at least, that's a specific and would be a kind of idiosyncratic, I guess, notion of causation. I think people would, some people would balk at that as kind of an explication of causation, right? So it's kind of simpler to just give you the account with sort of removing the causation link from the picture, I guess. Yeah, but yeah, I wouldn't mind that. In fact, that's how Bird initially, when he was kind of getting to the notion of progress, he kind of said cause, and then he changed it to promote, and then Rowbottom had responsible for, which is also in this sort of same ballpark of notions. Yeah, I mean, that would, I guess that would probably be fine if you did it that way. Yeah.
All right, we don't have a lot of time. Is one of your two questions very quick or not?
My two questions have been kind of taken care of by Nielsen and Lorenzo.
Okay, great. So, please try to be quick.
Right. So in some cases, some courses of events or so that usually we would expect really not to be conducive to progress might be so. Right. So for example, some book that has some very valuable information, but maybe one tiny mistake and it gets lost, and you have to conduct the same studies again, but this actually needs us to correct the mistake that we would otherwise have never found.
Yeah.
Right, something like this might happen. I don't mean this at all as countering something, because I think there really is a sense in which this event then does lead to progress. I'm just a little bit worried that when one might then think, but maybe we want a different sense of leading to progress for actual evidence that's actually truthful or so, or some things that you substitute under maybe leading to progress instead of constitutional progress. Maybe one would want to say that's in some stronger sense, I don't know.
Yeah.
Leading to progress than this event that just happened to actually be leading to progress.
Yeah, I mean, I can see some days of the week and can kind of see why. Yeah, I can see what you're getting at, yeah. But I guess one way to respond to that is to say, well, but notice that this is precisely I mean, is it the converse type of case, or is it the same kind of case that the tricky case? Because it's a case where you expect no progress, right? Subjectively, you should expect no progress, but in fact, there's lots of progress that it leads to, right? So it's precisely the type of case where the subjective and the objective notions of, whatever we call them, conflict. And so that alone might account for our uneasiness to talk about this as like an extraordinary amount of promoted progress, right? So I guess ultimately I think actually this kind of collection of notions, if you sort of have not just the notion of constitutional progress, but these two different kinds of promotion, or however you want to call them, I think they together actually account for these kinds of cases quite well. And that's all we really want. I mean, I think we should not want an account. I mean, the point of having an account is not to somehow like capture, if we sort of look at each word and how we would apply it in a particular case, like counter or sort of account for our intuitions about whether there's constitution or promotion or something else. I mean, I think that's not a good methodology in these sorts of cases. We need to kind of look at it holistically and say, well, in these cases where we are conflicted, where something is slightly off, does the overall theoretical machinery sort of provide an explanation for why there is something slightly off? And I think the answer here is yes, because of the sort of mismatch between the objective and the subjective notions of promotion in precisely these types of cases. So that's, I guess, at least for now, that's how I would want to respond. But also, of course, another type of response would just be, well, of course, please then tell me what this story is about this kind of special kind of promotion that is so good, but it's not present in that kind of case. So I would sort of have to look at that story, and I suspect it's not going to be a very plausible. It's going to be kind of ad hoc one, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that's kind of the worry, I guess, with that sort of kind of.
Right, I think that's the end. Please join me in thanking Finnur.
Thanks.